What am I? What are we anyways? What am I? What are we anyways? The world creates itself. That's an interesting chapter name. The world creates itself. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. We are magic to our minds. Our minds are magic. Thinking is magic. Meaning is magic. Any sufficiently advanced technology, meaning, thinking, our minds are magic. Common sense recognizes that the world is not in the head, not in neural tissue. Common sense is wrong. It's a hard thing to admit. We want to be. We want to be special. We abhor the idea that we are kind of Legoed together by processes that are not particularly transcendent, common to all animals everywhere. We want to be individual existent intelligences that choose freely and are the pinnacle of creation. We want to be transcendent intelligences that peer into the secrets of creation. We believe in what we see and in what we think and what we think about what we see. One part of the false analogy is that the waiting outside world comes through neural tissue, visually through the retina, colliculus, etc., and is caught or appreciated or reconstructed or somehow reflected or imaged in the brain. It's very hard not to think thusly, even for advanced thinkers, but inevitably ends with the dreaded homunculi of one species or another. You know what homunculus is. It's that little man who has to be inside the brain, who finally thinks about all the inputs coming in, puts it all together. It's a kind of small human that we seem to need to think because we can't think that brain tissue can be doing it all. Here, brain tissue, or the information processor, or the integrating module, becomes the deep down inside little man who finally puts it all together and understands. But the world out there is already a very high abstract idea. And as we'll see, an abstraction is a perception, language, culture generated thing that is created by the clan. We have indubitably learned that the retina, the very complex rod and cone organization and subsystems of the macula, fovea, plus the bipolar and amarine cells and many and various other types of ganglia and many other supporting cells, we've indubitably learned this is nothing like an old-fashioned film camera or a modern camera's CCD or processing chip. Yet we keep striving to show how the world signals itself through the wires of our brains to show itself to us. Hopefully show itself as it actually is. But that hope is just a story that has developed because we've not seen clearly the basis and bases of how our bodies work. And that other story makes us feel good. Because cultures, societies, co-create our minds. It was natural for naturalistic theories of seeing, thinking, and existing to gain predominance. Patterned light impinges on light-sensitive groups of cells that selectively react to and immediately begin to create and generate what along the way and in the end differentiates things in the world. That's true. This is a bit of an aside. Everyday experiencing and science both assume the world out there and try and understand deeply how differentiated radiation patterns of light gets that world out there into our noggins. But as stated, the world out there is already a very high-level abstraction that the brain also has to create. An abstraction is a perception, language, culture-generated thing. We have a whole chapter on how the visual world is Legoed together by quite a small set of specifically reactive retinal groups that react to, are stimulated by, and consequently create quite a small set of characteristic features or patterns that in turn are triggered along to all the higher nuclei and midbrain and cerebral structures that collectively create the visual world. Cell assemblies are stimulated by what eventually are very high level interpreted as pattern bars, edge, line orientation, shape, color, directed movement traces, and specific aspects of spatial organization. Parts of the eye of the retina react only to these things. And they're passed along, and they're not passed along coherently as the thing out there, but somehow they're put together as the thing out there. Complex patterns are not strictly spatially organized in transmission, not organized spatially in the lateral geniculate nuclei or the other structures. They're processed, which is a computer term that is a metaphor for the excitatory inhibitory complex of synaptic reactivities that cells do to each other at many levels. And these not spatially organized transmissions are sent along to many areas of the cortex, passed on as further excitations. It's important to think deeply about this. Neural tissue, as tissue, isn't programmed at all. We are not computers. Light signal innervations of retinal cells tune and most literally create the sensitivities of the tissue and tissue structures that react more and more sensitively to what the organism living in its echo niche needs to differentiate in order to survive. The central nervous system and the six-layered cerebrum complexly link themselves together over a few years. The linking together must happen under stimulation, or the world will not appear. If the linking is disrupted at any key juncture, the world and the self will not appear. Genes lay down specific species-specific pathways, but the impinging influences, sight, sound, touch, proprioception, etc., create the structures that encode the signals to be human usable. Neural tissue elaborates itself, its structures, in biochemical echo niches that tune it to the environment. The structures aren't visible, although we can follow some forms of axonal patterning and some forms of modular hookup and some forms of bioelectrical patterning and even some forms of tissue localization. The reality of engineering a little human into a big human may well be almost entirely in neural net synaptic modulations that are present day invisible and possibly completely ontologically invisible. We'll see this examining neural nets. We don't have a good model as to what all this really entails. It's too big for our everyday lumbering, linear abstraction producing brains. I'll say that again. It's too big for our everyday lumbering, linear abstraction producing brains. Human minds are particularly weak at, not well adapted to grasping dynamic, quickly changing complexity. We don't recognize holographic patterning interacting hardly at all. And multi-level parallel processed interactions of many separate modular inputs have little coherence for us. Yet, on almost every scale, this is what the brain does. Our usable models are mostly bare schematics of linear attachments. We constantly hearken back to computer models that have little relevance to organic functioning. The final chapter of this book and of this presentation on neural nets even more spectacularly lays bare another dimension of incomprehensibility related to how neural networks encode the word synaptically, nodally. Reentrant. Reentrant, which means massively, multimodally back and forth connected, pathway patterns develop that become more and more able. There is no thought without the slowly elaborating thalamic cortical pathways joining themselves together. There are no memories without the associative tissue connecting itself to itself. Multiple highly differentiated nuclei orchestrate millisecond cadenced interactivities that tune themselves to incoming signals and tune themselves, the nuclei and the tissue tunes itself to itself. Flesh, differentiated tissue, creates itself via genes and the miracle vessel of the fertilized cell. But the world creates itself from the dynamic interactivities of signal and differentiating flesh. We'll see this. There's more. There are ferocious complexities regarding alpha, gamma, beta, mu, etc. oscillations in the brain that certainly partially encode the real way the brain works, that control everything from memory to attention to cadencing of signals to dreaming to dampening, etc., etc. Which again, our science math not to mention everyday serial explanations, seem scarcely ready to tackle. Theorists theorize about the nature of synchronized oscillations of large groups of neurons, hoping somehow forlornly, by my reckoning, that this activity somehow gives a clue to how to solve what they call the binding problem, how things come all together in the end. And they ascribe fantastic possibilities to a type of tissue interactivity that really we have the most primitive tools to work with. And this oscillatory interconnectivity may be much more the cause or reality of thinking, synchronization of complex modular resonances, than any present-day model. We may still know nothing. Antonio Damasio importantly reminds us that the internal proprioceptive systems that come to make up the proto-self, precognitive, homeostatic awarenesses that we scarcely have a vocabulary to express, are systems of linked and reentrant living tissues that are never disconnected from all the other constituent linked living tissue systems. Not in sleep, until death. And like many systems of the body, these subsystems are non-consciously aware all the time. Yes, by modern standards, this is a confusing term, non-consciously aware, but remarkably apt and applicable to the human organism. Did you know that animals are non-consciously aware? Actually, awareness is rare. We'll see this. And the tissues signal or innervate back and forth in never-ending loops. The world grows the child to be in the world as the child's brain grows the world. A baby's ears are stimulated and very complex levels of interaction slowly grow in connected parts of the brain. Reentrant, multi-path, back and forth pathways develop that become more and more able. Background sounds are parsed. Foreground, highly structured and cadenced sounds, phonemes, morphemes, syllables, words, start to be recognizable and become able to cohere or coalesce and associatively reproduce patterns that are less and less evanescent, more and more attached to other internally reproducing and reproducible patterns. We know quite indubitably that foveal vision, the acute vision we rely on for detail, scans only 10% of our 180-degree visual field right in front of our faces. We know that our eyes saccade, which means change focus 3 times a second, changing focus orientation, and that the eyes bounce around massively. We know that the systems of retinal cells only react to quite a limited number of primitives that must somehow be constructed into the complex visual surfaces we believe we perceive. Yet I see a stable world all around me, mountains over there, the sky, this desk, all are contained within a perfectly recognizable world. Later, I will go into phenomenological detail about what it actually feels like to look at a tree in detail, awake to what is actually happening in my organism. We know indubitably that all sensation, externally mediated, sight, hearing, body touch mediated, and internally mediated, proprioception in its many, many manifestations, orientation of limb, digestion, etc., relies on myriad upon myriad unconscious processes that science studies in more and finer detail. Energy metabolism, transmission of nerve excitations, attentional tuning, eye, head, body orientation, and almost uncountable other processes are the substrates and necessary conditions for continued existence and the useful function of crucial bodily processes and awareness itself. And all the hundreds, thousands of unconscious body physical processes that we are make possible our experience of the world as seamlessly stitched together. The child doesn't in any way consciously learn the world. The experience of the world, what a human child sees out of his eyes, hears, feels of his own body, comes into existence and simply is. In spite of the fact that eventually myriad upon myriad of thoughts trundle through my mind, my experience of the world through my senses is not verbal, obviously. In spite of the fact that I can name everything in creation and generate sentences about every process in creation and differentiate everything I see in creation via language, the world is not its description. And the world is not science's description either, including mathematical description, or what I much later dubbed the then Neumann-Turing-Shannon modeling of the world, which has become the modern way we see the world. And most obviously and profoundly, my experience of the world through my senses is also contingent. It once was not, is now, and one day will not be forever. Contingent. Clunk me on the head hard enough, give me a nice dose of propofol, let me fall asleep, and the world through my senses shuts itself off, evaporates. What word should we use? Evaporates, shuts itself off, hopefully only for a while. Although eventually, in death, it may shut itself off for a very long time. And also profoundly, I can't really remember when the world through my senses began. A few more thoughts about this relatively abstract chapter, way of seeing things. We misunderstand ourselves most profoundly when we misapply concepts and domains of experience. We have perforce framed ourselves and examined ourselves through pre-scientific disciplines of philosophy and religion and literature using incommensurate vocabularies. And we've become enamored of how high and mighty and exceptional our clan-generated stories make us feel. Our bodies are co-created, Many world signals tune the tissue to better react to, parse the world signals. But they are co-created preconsciously. The neonate is not cognitively conscious of its development. How could it be? Our bodies are co-created preconsciously and slowly modulate themselves to ultimately function human expertly and human efficiently. Our brains, like every animal's brains, are co-created to become expert and effective in various environments and eco-niches by those very environments and niches. Further, the modern human brain undergoes another massive co-creation. Highly differentiated verbal signaling, previously elaborated by the clan, by the culture, very early becomes the premier signaling modality of human children. Very early, the signal tunes human neural tissue to become profoundly sensitive to the signal. Elaborating and differentiating brain tissue and modules signal the cerebral cortex and tune it to more and more efficiently, effectively parse language and clan signaling of many types. Because we are partially created by language, we cannot understand who or what we are until language is created in us. We cannot be conscious of the working of language because it is a gradually elaborated automatism. Automatisms are mechanisms of the body that integrate many and varied signals into useful working gestalts that improve functioning massively. As we'll also later examine, we've also industrialized and monetized and homogenized language implantation and use so effectively that we no longer can even imagine its origin. As we'll examine, in the last 500 years, our societies have been taken over by story memes. And quite recently, we've reverse engineered electronic instruments of presentation, radio, television, computers, Google, and YouTube, to be so effective in the service of story that modern humans can hardly imagine any other way of seeing themselves. And culture tunes the brain inexorably to speak and believe in words and stories. And more stories presented to the brain tune the brain to need more stories. I presented many fairly abstract and complex ideas that relate quite practically to everything that we're going to see in the next few chapters. Some of them I've presented as finished ideas as if proven, but we will see them in the next chapters, and we'll see a lot more reasons why they are simply true about what we are and who we are.